So with that, I'm going to introduce Eric Weiss here. He's a virtual CTO, so he's not actually here right now. He's just a virtual presence device. Yeah, like Big Bang Theory, of Voyagent. And he's going to be talking about leveraging user feedback and analytics to build the product your users need. And I'm going to let him do a more detailed intro and take it over from here. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you very much. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? In the back? It's all good? All right. So I'm here to talk to you about how you can use your data to help make better product decisions, to help become a more data-driven company. This is a bit of a challenging topic because it is a pretty wide field. There's a lot of tools. I talk about some tools, but there's a lot of things, at your disposal. What I'm going to try to do is really focus on kind of the key domains of analytics, some of the really, I would say, critical applications of it, and try to give you something practical that you can take away and apply to your business tomorrow. So my name is Eric Weiss. I am a fractional or virtual CTO, which means instead of working for one company, I work for several, and a product strategy consultant. And I've spent about 10 years in the analytics and data science space. So I was at Qualcomm for about a decade doing analytics and data science. I had a consulting practice on the side that I've run for the last 10 or 12 years or so. And then one of my clients pulled me on to be their full-time CTO, where I was for about 5 years. And I took that discipline and that information with me to apply to this startup. And so basically what I'm going to talk to you about today is essentially a distillation of that experience during that period, how I used my background in data science and analytics to actually drive our product strategy and our growth. Okay, so, the obligatory, why are we here? Why do you care about analytics? Obviously, if you're sitting in this room, you agree that it matters. But the key thing that I want to kind of drive home here is if you're a founder, chances are you're pretty sure of yourself, and you might have strong opinions and beliefs about what your users want and need. And I would say that is also the fatal flaw in a lot of founders. And so what analytics and what your data allow you to do is to make more objective and better strategic decisions. So taking your own opinions out of the equation, and really listening to your users, really understanding how they act and behave, and applying that to your decision making. And also allows you to understand them at scale. So when you're first starting out, you actually can meet one-on-one with your customers, right? You can be where they are. You can visit them in person. You can do focus groups and so on. But as your platform scales, you then start to lose sight of who those people are, and you tend to bias towards that initial cohort of people. So analytics will allow you to make these strategic decisions, at a higher level when your target market become larger and more varied. Creates tight feedback loops. So I'm a major advocate for agile development, agile principles, not only within the software development team, but in product strategy and startups in general. And this allows you, once you've invested in analytics in those tools within your platform, it makes it really easy to launch a feature, test its efficacy, change it, test its efficacy, and so on. You don't have to do a whole bunch of manual testing or surveying or so on every time you release a new feature. And generally helps us deal with the unknown. So another thing is being a founder, being a CEO is often a lonely endeavor. And there's a lot of times when you're out there and you don't really know what the right answer is, and it's really difficult when there aren't people out. You're at the tip of that spear. You're in uncharted territory. Listening to your users, listening to your data is probably the best answer you're going to get. Okay. So I like to think about it as the scientific method applied to product development. So the scientific method, basically, you start out with a problem or an idea, and you come up with a hypothesis about it, right? So there's a fundamental question that you want to answer, or a belief that you have, right? I believe that customers that experience this particular flow, or see this this modal at this stage in the flow, or whatever it might be, are more likely to convert than those who don't, or those who follow this other path. Okay, well let's create an experiment around it. Well, to create a good experiment, You need a control. You need to minimize your variables, right? So you need to be able to, you need to have a number of different variants or a number of different cases that you can control for, then measure the output so that you can definitively say, this path is better than this one, or this feature has more of an impact on our outcomes than this other one here. You collect the data, you analyze it, you draw conclusions, and then you make decisions based on it. So this is the data-driven model of product development here. So again, rather than just talking to people, rather than just going with your gut, anytime you're thinking about a new feature or thinking about changing your existing workflow in your product, think about, well, how can we test it? How quickly can we go out, collect some data, and make some real, data-driven conclusions? Okay. So here's where it gets a little technical, a little down the weeds. Sorry for the small screen, by the way. When I wrote these slides, I had this nice big fat monitor in my face. So if anyone needs these slides later on, feel free to reach out to me. But I'll do my best to cover the important parts. The key here to this slide is there are, I believe, 3 major ways to gather user feedback. You can ask them, which will tell you kind of their intents and their belief, their conscious beliefs. You can observe them to see how they really behave or how their choices are made, and then analyze them so you can see the patterns in the aggregate, right? And so you can imagine that you start off very personal, very one-on-one, and as your user base grows, you need to rely more and more on sort of computer-driven models to make these kinds of decisions. But then you can also scale these as well, right? So you start off with interviews and focus groups early on, but then as your platform scales, you might do drip campaigns or drip surveys. So many of you probably have, whether you do marketing or you have a marketing person, you may do a drip survey that is like trying to get people to convert or refer a friend or purchase some promotion or what have you. But you can also use this to gather feedback about your product. Okay, we just launched a new feature. Track anytime a new user engages with this new feature, finishes this new flow, the next day, send them an email and ask them how their experience was with that new feature, that kind of thing. Even the interviewing and the surveying in general. So, NPS is a great one, right? So having an annual kind of in-depth survey that you send out where you ask a lot of product questions, even in your customer service flow. So when somebody calls or writes in, they have a problem, you can follow that up not only with, how was your experience with the customer service rep, but then also include some product questions there. And so you kind of bake these things in to all of your different channels where you have touch points with your customers, and then that becomes a data set that you can draw from to profile your users, to understand their behavior, their intentions, their choices, and so on. Dormant surveys. So if a user stops using your service after a while, if they disappear for a couple weeks, then you can have sort of a dead man switch, right, where it reaches out to them and says, you haven't engaged with us for a couple of weeks. Tell me why. And you can have a few buttons in an email that says, I didn't have time, or I chose a competitor, or I thought your product was too expensive, or what have you. And that's good data that can help you drive better product decisions going forward. And there's a number of tools here. Again, I don't know if it's hard to read. One thing I will say, I've peppered tools throughout this whole thing because people like it. People like to have something really tangible that they can go off and run with. This is by no means comprehensive. The one thing I'll say about tools today is anything you see here, Google it, followed by versus, like VS, right? So MailChimp VS. And Google will give you all of the potential alternatives and whatever, and all the pros and cons, and other people who've done the analysis better than I can. So these are just kind of examples that can sort of seed that, that path of due diligence for yourself. Okay, so observing them. Again, people are going to tell you what they want, but it's better to actually see how they behave and how they reach certain choices and conclusions. So user testing videos, something that you can do in person, usability testing. But I also really like usertesting.com. It's a little expensive. It's pretty expensive. It's maybe $150 or something per video that you record. But what's really critical about this is it'll give you users that have never touched your product before. So there's a huge bias in existing users. So if you're always going back to the same cohort of people in your beta group or what have you, people that are, that are friendly to you, that know your product, they've used it for several years or whatever it might be, they understand the idiosyncrasies of it. They're more likely to adopt new features, tell you they're great, or so on. You got to go find brand new people who've never seen it before occasionally and get their unbiased feedback. There's also some pretty cool SDKs, platform or APIs that you can bake into your app or your website. Appsy and Hotjar are really cool because they actually let you record the actual session. So they'll upload a video where you can actually see what people are doing, what they're clicking on, how they traverse through your flows. They give you heat maps so you can see where people are tapping and swiping. And so, if you see a big red blob around something that isn't a button but kind of looks like one, then that tells your designer that, oh, we need to make sure that this thing doesn't look like a button. Okay. And then analysis. So this is where the focus of this talk is going to be. But essentially, we want to understand where our users came from, because our channels are different. Users coming from different channels behave differently. We want to profile them, so demographics and behavior and so on, to create categories and personas. We want to track their events, so things like activation, things like when they purchase, when they refer, but also as they engage with new features in an iterative fashion. We're going to talk about A/B testing. So you have different versions or different variants of an individual feature or flow. You actually test those variants and measure the output. And then just to touch on where this goes from there in terms of predictive modeling and actually predicting behavior. Okay. So I wanted to start so this is kind of where I'm going to drill into kind of the meat of this here is how we apply analytics to our platforms. I like to start with this model because this is actually how with the companies I've worked for and all my clients and everything, this is where we start the conversation about product strategy. This is how we develop our product roadmap. It's a model called Pirate Metrics because it's AARRR, so it stands for R. But this is your basic funnel for acquiring new users, activating them, so getting them engaged in your platform, keeping them coming back, making money off of them, and having them refer their friends. So the way I apply product management across the board is every new feature that we're evaluating, we try to assess or score what impact we think it's going to have at different stages of the funnel. And then we score it and the priority comes out from there. But then we want to actually measure the outcome and then tie that back into our next round of roadmap planning or whatever it might be. So these are kind of the main business drivers that any new feature should align with. Okay. So there's a number of different things that we need to measure that roll up into those various business drivers. So activity, this is a really very nebulous term. It's something you have to define for yourself. But the basic activity is they opened your app or they logged into your website. Okay, well, that's step one. But then step two is, well, did they complete a flow? Did they purchase something? Did they engage in some new feature? There's various sort of activity events that you're going to want to capture. And that's just kind of the basic sort of lowest common denominator metric you need to track is how are people engaging with the platform? And then what are the outcomes from that? So, we want to track their retention. Do they come back and keep doing the thing a week later, a month later, a quarter later? Are they converting, right? Are they giving us money? Do they churn? Are they referring people? What's their customer acquisition cost? And that depends on the channel, right? And so when you kind of take all of these things together, revenue margin and so on, new feature adoption, you now have this model that you can slice and dice to say, oh, interesting, people that come in through this particular marketing channel or who are this type of demographic or persona are X% more likely to convert or churn or retain or engage with this new feature than people from these other channels. Or we have this revenue, so we may pay more for users on one platform, but they end up performing better across these metrics than others. And so this is where we should be investing our time and money and so on. So these are kind of like the little measures and the little nuggets that will ultimately roll up into all of your reporting. The basic conversion funnel, sales conversion funnel, so this is kind of like, as founders, the first thing that you really want to look at is what is the path that our customers take to get to a sale, right? So they log into your website, they view a product, they add it to their cart, and then they actually purchase. Sales funnel is obviously the basic, but you could think about any outcome or any goal that you have in your platform, whatever your platform may be. There's some outcome that you want your users to accomplish, and there's one or many paths that they can take to get there. And you have to create this funnel to see, well, how many people logged into the page but never viewed a product? Or how many people viewed a product but didn't add it to the cart, and so on. And anytime you see a really significant drop-off, I mean, you're going to see, it's a funnel for a reason. But anytime you see a really, really significant drop-off, that's actually where you want to increase the resolution of your analytics. So you want to, measure more things, do more engagement, more surveys, more monitoring, and so on, right? So you kind of have this really high-level funnel. And then where you see a problem, that's where you zoom in. Okay. Sorry for the word eye chart again. So we have to do some kind of event tracking in order to map the path to get to the outcomes that we want. So if you have a well-designed UX flow, it should be a fairly straightforward path from engaging with the platform all the way to the desired outcome. And one great bit of something to take away is actually go and measure and map out the flow, like boxes and diamonds, like create a flow chart. What does it take to get from that first activation all the way through to your desired outcome? And if it's a lot of steps and a lot of branches and a lot of potential ways they can go, you need to do some work on your UX, right? So there should be a very clear, discrete path all the way to the desired outcome without too many sort of ways to get lost or branch out into other places. And then you map the major events, right? That's okay, they've created an account, they've viewed a page, so on and so forth. And then also some minor events along the way. So all of those different possible branching paths they could take. Right? So if you have a well-mapped UX workflow, every single box or diamond in your workflow can be an event that you track so that you can see, if somebody takes this particular path, they might be more likely to have this desired outcome than others. Okay. Fair enough. So another quick thing around tools. I'm kind of leaning towards building this yourself. There are lots of tools out here that you can use. They all cost money. This is the seed track. I assume money is valuable to you guys. So the one thing I'll say is that it all takes work. It's an investment. So there's time and money that could be spent on building out new features and functionality that you're instead investing in analytics. And this is an investment in being able to make better decisions as you scale and grow. It's up to you guys, how much you're willing to invest in that. So I will kind of lean towards like, okay, here's how you could home grow, build it yourself. I'd say the main pros and cons is one, obviously, it takes more development resources. It takes longer to build up, that capacity. The benefit to building it yourself is you have all the data. If you use any of these tools, a lot of times they lock in your data. They don't allow you to download, whatever the events or whatnot are. And so then you're kind of stuck in their canned reporting. And so if you really want to be a true data-driven company, you're going to end up getting limited at a certain point. So you build it yourself, you capture all your own events, you create all your own funnels and everything. It's more work up front, but it allows you to, to have a lot more power and flexibility. Okay. A/B testing. How many people here have ever done A/B testing in a significant way? Okay, good number of you. Let's see. I want to split that a little bit. How many people here have done A/B testing with respect to product features? Okay, because it's commonly a marketing tool, right? It's something, we try different variants of communication. Yeah. So where this has really helped is, you're sitting around the room. Okay, you guys are founders. You're sitting around the room with your head of marketing, your head of sales, your CTO, and you're kind of debating about some new feature that you want to build. And there's some argument or debate around how it should be built. Whether it's design choices, language, whatnot, where a feature gets introduced in the flow. And I always say, okay, well, let's go test it. If there's ever a point where we start to see, hey, we're at an impasse here, it's your opinion versus mine, how do we create an experiment around this? And this is actually where this whole philosophy began with me, is too many of these kinds of conversations where it was just my opinion against my CEO's, and then we ultimately decided, wow, okay, let's actually create an experiment. Let's try both, measure the outcomes, and see what works better. And I don't remember who was right or wrong, but there were times when I was right. There were times when when the other folks were right. But it allowed us to take the emotion out of it, take our opinions out of it, and really just drive towards a solution. Okay, so the way you do this is you add all of your users to particular cohorts. So there's just like a table in your database, and anytime you create a new user, you do a little random number generator, and you say you're in the control group, you're in variant A, variant B, what have you. I recommend doing this more for new users because there's less bias or less room for other variables than with existing users, because then you have to control for like, well, how long have they been users and whatnot. New users, it's sort of like a more fair comparison. So the idea is that every time you release a new feature, you're going to get new users coming in. This is the best way for you to measure, the performance of a particular feature or flow. Okay, so you develop multiple experiences behind conditional logic. So you have, an if-then statement. If they're in cohort A, show them this flow. If they're in cohort B, show them that flow. And then you measure the outcomes. So again, back to those, those activity and engagement metrics. People who were in cohort A were more likely to come back after 7 days. They were more likely to refer their friends. They're more likely to convert. They have a higher lifetime value, what have you. You measure those outcomes, and then when you feel that the experiment is complete, you go back and you actually go and remove the other code, right? You remove the cohorts, you remove the other flows. And let me say this, as a CTO, don't do any of this. Don't listen to anything I say unless you do this part, because this is going to create an enormous amount of technical debt. Your engineers are going to hate you for it. Where this becomes a challenge is, let's say there's a couple variants of a feature, and you have a new user come on board and they get version B, and then you want to phase out version B. Well, now you have to introduce them to version A, and that might be a jarring experience, and you might say, we don't want to piss off our users. You got to get over it. So it might be a little bit dry. Hey, we run this experiment for a week, a month, what have you, and some people in one of the cohorts that failed, that didn't convert or didn't have the right outcome, now have a weird experience where they come back and they see something different, and maybe they don't like that. Who knows? But that's a sacrifice that you have to be willing to make in order to actually support your platform, as it scales, and for this model to really, make sense in the long run.
Do you inform your users as to why you're moving?
Only if it's a really big change. Oh, sorry. The question is, do we inform your users, when you do that kind of thing? Yeah, only if it's a really major change, or if they're a really long time user, if they've been around for a really long time. The A/B, that's why I said the A/B testing works best when they're really brand new users and they're not really attached. I would say just in general, if you're changing a major feature and you have long time existing clients, that's something that does have to be handled gently. Yeah, Snapchat, right. Okay, yeah, a little tangent here, but not all users are created equal. Attribution is really important. So knowing where your users come from, right? Did they come from, okay, they came from Facebook, or they came through some targeted marketing campaign, or they picked up a flyer with a promo code, what have you, is not only going to affect how they convert, and all those metrics, everything that you're measuring are going to be different, slicing, dicing by your channel, but then even like the way they engage with your platform might be different. And this is where later on, I'll talk about how you can actually create varied experiences depending on what you know about your users coming in. This is an example. So you might have, say, users on Facebook that, yeah, okay, you can buy them for a few dollars a user, but they're really not tech savvy. They're not early adopters. They're not really going to be willing to put up with, new features or things breaking or what have you. And so you can kind of put them along one path of, okay, these guys don't get the new feature as soon as it rolls out, for example. Or you might have another, cohort that you purchase through some, targeted, co-branding kind of thing, mutual referral, and those folks are early adopters. They're the ones that you're pushing referrals to because they're the most likely to do it, what have you. So it's really important to understand where your best users are coming from, not only for all of your marketing campaigns, but then also how you actually treat them in the product as well. Okay. I'm doing really good on time. All right, we'll have a lot of time for Q&A, I think. So let me slow down, actually. Are there any questions at this point? I don't want to dive in. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is back to like the A/B testing.
Yeah.
So you're saying like test it for like new users, and then once you're done with that experiment, how do you roll out that new feature to your old users? Like how do you make that smooth transition?
Yeah. Well, again, so it's a good question. It really does depend. I think that if it's a brand new feature, brand new functionality, that's where I'm kind of going with a lot of this stuff. It's like we're building something new. This is a new feature, a new flow, and we want to test different variants of it. At that point, existing users, it doesn't quite matter as much. I think if you don't do this and you're trying to retrofit this, if you've already built your platform, and so actually this goes back to the original funnels. So let's say you've built your platform, you've never done any analytics before. Now you come in, you do a funnel, and you find a particular drop-off somewhere. You dive in, you start measuring, you're not exactly sure what's going on, and you want to actually tweak the product somehow. You might come up with some ideas, a hypothesis, and you say, okay, let's actually test it. Again, I think using new users is better, is preferable, but if you want to make a change to something that existing users are experiencing, if it's a small enough change, you can use modals or like coach tips, things like that. You can just sort of pop up, hey, new look, here's where that button went now, that kind of thing. If it's something really major, something you're really worried is going to negatively affect existing users, you do an email campaign. Right? So you pull out from your user base, everybody that's signed up, before this date, they're going to get an email blast. Hey, we're revamping this thing. It's going to be great, and you spin it positively. I have had situations where we've had users come back and say, I want my money back. I don't like this anymore. This isn't the way, this isn't what I signed up for. And we gave them their money back because, losing those old users was less important to us than, foregoing the potential growth that we had going forward.
So how do you know if it's like a valid feature so you're about to roll out this feature, is there like some type of protocol to make sure that you're not going to lose any users because this feature is such a drastic change, but the new users like it? I don't know if that makes sense, but I just asked you.
Yeah, well, I think, it's a similar question, but there is no protocol. There's no right or wrong way. I kind of touched on it a number of times here that if it's a significant change to an existing user base, you have to handle it with care. And I think messaging is the way to do it. A lot of sites will even have a kind of a beta period where, hey, try the new look. You can always go back, but then eventually they push you onto it. There's a lot of sites that do that. They have a staged rollout, if you will. But I would say that the most important thing is that if you're going to change it, get it right. Don't break it, right? One of the things that I would always argue about when we had these debates was our users would rather have what they have today working than a new thing that's broken, right? So the main thing you can do to piss off your users is to change something that worked for them and replace it with something that doesn't work or that's broken. So I would say, actually I have it later on the slide, but beta test it, stage rollout, do the profiling, tie it to your early adopters, do all of this stuff, right? A very measured approach. And then only once you are really certain that you're committed to it, that this is going to be great for everyone, it's going to help you grow, then you have to deal with that challenge of how do we seamlessly transition existing users. Yeah. Yeah, potential rollback for sure. Yes.
As you're growing and adding user segments, at what point do you decide to actually go back and retest something that maybe worked for the existing segments, or to figure out what is the right trigger? Do I change this now with an entirely new cohort?
So the question is roughly, at what point do you know you need to make a change to something, or what point do you need to do this? I would say if you do the analytics, if you're looking at your funnels and you see a problem, that is a point to question your existing assumptions, right? I mean, that is the scientific method, is, listen to the data and question your own assumptions. And so things that may have worked for you at some point in the past may not work for you anymore. Or it may have worked for that initial cohort of users that loved you early on, but it doesn't work for the mass market. So a lot of this stuff that I'm kind of talking to you guys about, I don't know where folks in the room are today, but if you're at the seed stage now, you probably still have a pretty good connection with a representative sample of your user base. But as your company grows, as your user base grows, they become much more varied. They don't resemble the people that you know anymore. And that's a point where I think you need to go back and say, well, okay, hey, we've grown a lot, but now we're seeing problems in our funnel. Let's go back and see what's going on there and measure it and try to test something new. Yes?
What do you do if you have certain bits of data that are contradicting each other?
Yeah, good question. What do you do if you have data that contradict each other? Like my data is better than your data. It's a hard question. It really does depend. Let's see, where do I have it? I have it somewhere in here. But it's the pitfalls, the last slide. Okay, so a lot of good questions out of order. So it's kind of throwing me off. But it's important to trust your data, right? And so the way you get to a point where you trust your data is that it comes from a reliable source, that there aren't gaps, that there's no corruption in the data, understanding that you're collecting the right variables or dimensions, the right profiles, what have you. You really have to take a solid approach to this, do it right, so that you get to a point where you do trust your data. Because if you don't, maybe you might have contradicting pieces, or maybe it just be that somebody in the room says, well, I don't believe the data because there might be some errors in it, or because I don't know where the data source, or I don't trust the data source, right? And that throws this whole thing out the window. So that's why kind of starting with those baseline metrics, build something that you trust, build something that you can verify, that is accurate, and then you start building your conclusions and whatnot on top of that. I hope that answers your question. That was a tough one. Okay, let me move on, and then we can talk more at the end. So let's see. Okay, profiling and predictive modeling. I'm going to split this slide up real quick and talk about profiling since I've got time. It's very important to profile your users because that creates the dimensions that you can use to segment and slice and dice your data. So if your data set are too large, and you sort of lump everybody in together, you're going to lose statistical significance. Like, you're going to lose the impact. You're not going to have really definitive conclusions. But if you can slice your data down into smaller and smaller sets, you can find that, oh wow, there's a really definitive difference between whether it's an A/B test or somewhere along the funnel for this particular group of users. So what's really interesting is so demographics, for example, it's hard to talk about demographics without offending people. So I'm going to say you've got yellow, blue, and red users. And there may be a number of different variables that go into those different colors. But they're going to behave differently. They're going to perform differently. Okay. There's age, there's gender, there's location, there's all these different things that make people kind of unique and so on, who they are. And that actually change their behaviors and their choices and so on. And it's important for you to be able to kind of group them together and say, okay, people who look like this demographically behave in a certain way. And then you can actually start making predictions about how new people that come in who fit a certain profile are going to behave. So let's say, for example, people in the yellow group are less tech savvy. They're not your early adopters. Maybe they come in through some channel or whatever it might be. Where people in your blue category, they may be really tech-savvy early adopters. Okay, so that means the blue people are your beta testers, and they're going to be the people that you're going to be really touting new features to. They're going to be the people who get access to, say, like the advanced, flows, or you're going to drive them towards more customization, flexibility, and so on. Whereas the people in yellow might be on Rails. Right, so they're going to have a much more tailored kind of onboarding experience. You're going to kind of hide, a lot of the more advanced features, things like that. It's at least important to know where they are, so that if you're looking at, hey, why are these users not converting? Well, it's because, hey, these people are actually less tech savvy, and so they're not going, the way we rolled out this new feature, we didn't do enough, onboarding, for example. And then if the yellow group is much, much larger than the blue group, then that actually starts to tell you really who your target markets may be. Alternatively, if there's a small group of people that you only found by slicing and dicing, and when I say demographics, I don't necessarily mean about the person themselves. It could even be like, what other products do they use, or what kind of music they like, or whatever kind of data you can capture about these people. You might find a really small subset, a small segment of users that perform really, really well. Wow, okay, that's a target market that you want to go after. Maybe you went after either a totally different target market or something really broad, but then you found buried within your data this little nugget that, hey, there is this small subset of users that perform exceptionally. Let's figure out how to expand that. Let's figure out how to grow that particular cohort, okay? So when we get to the profiling, we get to slicing and dicing, we can start making predictions about how other people will behave. So if you're a new user and I take you through some onboarding flow and I might ask you some questions, I can then make a prediction about how you're going to behave, based on other people that look like you. And that's where predictive modeling comes in. I just want to kind of touch on this because it is a big element of analytics, and it's something that, if you're here in the room, you've probably heard about it. I mean, predictive modeling ties into machine learning, AI, and so on. And a lot of people, I'm sure there's a lot of people here who've asked the question, like, do I need AI? Do I need machine learning? That kind of thing. But just how it all ties into this is it allows you to look at varied groups of people, basically splitting people by multiple dimensions and variables, and then making predictions on their outcomes, and then acting on those predictions. So a predictive model is basically just a multivariable prediction. I might as well just use the technical term. So multivariate regression is where you take a number of different dimensions about this person. So everything that I know that makes somebody in that yellow category, all those different variables, I don't know which one contributes the most to the particular outcome. Again, talking back to conversion and engagement and retention and all those sorts of things. There's something about these people that makes them more likely to have the positive outcome, but I don't know what it is. And it's really hard for me to kind of manually go through and run all these SQL queries or reports or what have you to get to that. And that's where predictive modeling and regression comes in, is I can throw a whole bunch of variables at it, run it through some statistics, and it'll actually tell me correlation. It'll tell me which of these variables have the biggest contributing factor to the outcome that is desired, right? So again, this might be something a little advanced for a lot of people, but it's kind of ultimately where you're going down this path of being very data-driven in terms of product development. Is first you collect your data, you kind of look at it on the surface. What are the data telling me? Then you start slicing and dicing the data. Say, okay, here are the outcomes, here are the measures, but how do those measures differ between different groups of people, different A/B testing variants and so on? And then ultimately get to a point where you say, well, how can I actually make predictions about what people that I don't know, how they're going to act and behave? And then is there a way that I can actually nudge them onto the right path? For example, can I give a different marketing campaign or a different onboarding flow, change some verbiage, something like that? Is there a way I can nudge their behavior towards a path that I know has a good outcome based on some initial information that I can gather from them, right? Okay. finally, I'm starting to tie it up. So data visualization, there are a ton of tools out there. There's so many tools out there. It's such a crowded space. I don't really want to talk about it too much, but you guys can look into it. The one thing that I'll say about this is don't do your analytics off of your production system. Sync the data to a staging environment and run all your number crunching and so on off of production. That's the one thing I'll say. It's amazing to me how many companies just basically run their data warehouse right off their live transaction system and then wonder why performance is so bad. So don't do that. Okay. Another little tangent around crashing and bug monitoring. So this is different from the kind of engagement sales funnel type analytics, but it's something that's really valuable. So as your user base scales and grows, especially if you're in the mobile space, especially if you're on Android, and you've got a lot of different variables that can contribute to failures in your technology, you want to be able to capture attributes of those people. What device are they on, the OS version, the app version? What's their network connectivity look like? What steps did they take before they ultimately ran into the crash? And then obviously, the stack trace that your developers can look at. Prevention is the best medicine. So, before you roll something out, test it and test it again. Do a staged rollout and then monitor the output. Right? Make sure that you should be able to see whether or not the thing is stable before you roll it out to everybody. It's always a lot more difficult, and your engineers are going to hate you if you just push a new feature out without testing it and it's full of bugs and they don't have the ability to track it. Okay. Pitfalls. So data analytics in general, these are just sort of the common things that you may suffer from. The sample size being too small. Not being representative of your users. So it's important to know, again, by the profiling and so on, who your users are. And then as you're doing these different reports and A/B testing and so on, that when you're putting people in these cohorts, you need to make sure that you're running the experiment long enough, collecting enough data, and that each of those cohorts are representative of your user base as a whole. To your question, dirty source data. So it's very important that your data has integrity, that you're not losing events, for example, because an app crashes and events don't fire off. So you need to have systems that collect this data that are reliable. Don't introduce too many variables. So if you're running this kind of experiment and you want to launch a new feature, measure its outcome, but that release has 15 different new features in it, it's going to be really hard to tell which of those features actually contributed to those outcomes. And it's one line of code. So all these tools, the vendors are going to tell you it's one line of code, it's 20 minutes. Don't believe them. It's totally a sham. It might be one line of code to import the SDK, but to actually get it to do what you want, there's a lot of work that goes into this. And kind of as I said at the top, this is an investment that you're making not in a feature, not in customer value, but in your ability to make better decisions as you scale. So there's some point in your life cycle where this is going to be a differentiator for you and a way that you're going to make sure that you execute. And if it's not you, your competitors are going to do it. So then the question is how much and at what point do you start to make this investment? Okay. That's it. That's my talk. Before I get to Q&A, I just want to do one quick little plug. I'm doing a new product workshop at the end of the summer where I'm going to be talking about how to validate products and features and how to apply agile development principles or agile principles to product management, product strategy, and engineering as well. So if you're interested, here's a sign-up link, but you're also welcome to reach out to me. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming. All right. So we got 5 minutes. Yes.
How do you generate insights from data, or how do you know the insights you're generating are the correct ones?
How do you take insight from your data, right? So how do you go from the raw data to a trend, to a conclusion, to an insight? That is a tough question. Let me just say, I'm not going to answer your question, but I will say that it's very important not to get too much into the raw data. Never show a graph to a CEO, for example, right? And in fact, don't even show them a trend. Show them what the trend means. And this is what good analysts do, is they look at data, they look at trends, and then they try to come up with reasons for those trends. that's a whole discipline of analysis. So you might ask certain people that fit in the bar that you're looking at. You might, look at other data that support it, that, to try to confirm it. But I can't tell you exactly how to get insight from it because it really depends on the data set. But I think it is really important to go to that level. Don't just throw charts at your CEO, or they're gonna send you back to the drawing board. Yes.
So if you're not a data person, how would you vet a good data scientist?
Yeah.
Data person.
That's a good question. I would say, so analytics, really the purpose of it is to answer business questions. So any good analyst should be able to talk to you in terms of the business questions that you're trying to answer, and then be able to tell you, well, here's how I would go to the data and try to answer that question, right? So when you talk about a data scientist, a lot of times that's like a really wonky statistician who's going to say, well, tell me what you want me to measure and I'll measure it for you, right? That might not necessarily be the right person here. A good analytics person is somebody who kind of lives on the business side, but is really good at working with data. So they may have been an engineer at some point in their life, but now they're in analytics or product management or even marketing. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, question for scale. So when you're at scale, you have multiple teams touching a given release, maybe multiple teams touching a given feature.
Yeah.
What would you recommend as a process and practice to make sure their events and what they're measuring doesn't overlap and doesn't, one sullies the other?
Yeah, right. So the question is around, what if you're changing too much too fast? You have too many different people kind of touching the same code, affecting the features, and you kind of lose that ability to really control for the experiment. That's a problem. So the only way that I would suggest is people in a certain cohort don't get to see other changes until the experiment is done. That's one way to do it. This is more... Okay, so this is a little bit contradictory to a CI/CD kind of model where you're just making changes every single day. I would say that you have to make the decision what change is a significant enough change that it might interfere with an existing experiment, and make sure that you stage those releases.
So the time duration becomes really critical, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
at some point you lock that cohort out of certain other things that might be happening.
Yeah. Yeah, typically, like I would say, we would run an experiment for usually a week is enough time to collect enough new users in all the various cohorts. So if you're releasing like significant features and changes more than once a week, then you might have to do some more work to kind of control for that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you guys. Oh, sorry, one more.
Do you have tips for streamlining testing when you can't do automated watching, like your users are protected classes and spy?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
So if you can't set up automated tools to watch and track analytics on your users, do you have
Right.
tips for doing face-to-face testing? Or
Yeah.
ways to streamline that?
Yeah, well, that kind of goes back to the beginning where around, surveying, drip campaigns, things like that. I mean, any way that you can engage with them, if you're not allowed access to the data, then you got to go collect data. That is more difficult. So, yeah. All right, thank you all very much. I appreciate your time. Okay. I will say I am a consultant, so I, again, as a fractional CTO, always looking for work. I got business cards up here, so if you or anyone you know would like me, then please reach out. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we could get some.
Yeah, grab a card, connect with me on LinkedIn or email, and I'll send you the slides.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure.